Hello YouTube. Today we're going to be taking a look at the French defense again. This is going to be part two of my four-part series on the French. This is just going to be where black basically decides to avoid the main line. So after the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, we're going to be looking at different black options to avoid the main line, which we're going to be covering in part 3. We're going to be covering the main lines, and we're going to be covering the Alekhine chartered attack in part 3. So this is part 2, where black just kind of avoids the main line. So the two things that we're going to be going over are, first off, we're going to be going over just d captures e4, and we're going to be going over d captures e4 in general, and we're also going to be going over d captures e4 after knight f6 and bishop g5, which are both a little bit different. So first, let's just go over if they play d captures e4 right away. So d captures e4, knight takes e4, knight f6, and then after the move knight f6, the normal move here is knight f6, queen f6, and the main thing that I just want to show you is that there's a very well-known trap here when this queen comes out early. There are other people that'll play gf6 in these positions, and that's a slightly different animal. So the main thing here is to play knight f3, and then this is a well-known trap where people will try to play this bishop d7 to c6 kind of early. But what happens is, and it's kind of cute, is there's actually a known trap where this queen actually gets trapped. So after bishop d3, bishop c6, the move to trap the queen. If you want to pause the video, see if you can find it. Okay, the move is bishop g5. And then I know a lot of you are thinking, well, don't they have bishop takes f3? Well, maybe they do. What would white's reply be here? Go ahead and stop the video, see if you can find it. Okay, the reply is queen d2. And amazingly, this queen is completely trapped, and you're actually winning a queen here. This is a very old trap. It's kind of a well-known trap. It's kind of a cool thing to know. You can win a lot of quick games this way. And the reason they can't play queen takes d4 is, of course, because, if you want to pause the video, it's the discovered check, bishop to b5 check. Okay, and after bishop b5 check, of course, you're going to pick up the queen. Okay, so we're going back here to d captures e4. Let's look at the sister variation of d captures e4, which is you play bishop g5 first. And then they go ahead and they play d captures e4 here, and then you play knight captures e4, and they play bishop to e7, and you play bishop to f6, bishop to f6. Now, I kind of recommend kind of a universal approach here. I like to play against all of these systems pretty much the same way, because there's actually a lot of different ways that they can play these systems. Sometimes they'll play like captures, and then sometimes they'll play knight on b to d7, and then they'll capture. And there's actually quite a few options. And I like to play this system for the most part. I like to play this system pretty universally. And then there's only one other thing that I have to kind of remember, which is what do I do if they take back with the g-pawn? And I'll show you that, in a moment. But let's just say even here, let's say they take back with the g-pawn. This is basically the thing that you have to remember if they take back with the g-pawn. Eventually they're going to play f5. And out of all the games that I've seen in all of the history, like let's say knight f3, they play f5 right away. The easiest way for white to get an advantage is you just have to remember to retreat this knight to c3. And if you think about this for more than 5 seconds, this makes a ton of sense, at least positionally, which is when they have this pawn structure with the pawn on f5, the knight going back to g3, it's not going to have a lot of forward-moving options there. It's kind of hitting a brick wall. But the knight on c3 is going to support d5. It's going to support play in the middle of the board. It's going to support ideas with knight e5 and then this pawn transferring. It just makes the most sense positionally. And I've had the most success with just bringing this knight back to c3 and just having some sort of advantage in these positions. So that's what I recommend there. So like I said, going back to this other option is after d captures e4, knight e4, bishop e7, bishop f6, bishop f6. I recommend knight f3, knight d7, bishop d3, and then just so you get an idea, the most trying continuation is probably something like c5. And I'm going to just say, from my perspective, I don't really care about this pawn, at least in the short term. I can always win this pawn back later. My main thing is just basically to set up my attacking idea, which is to play queen e2, castles queenside, and to play h4. So I'm going to set up that attacking idea regardless, and I don't care if I lose the pawn. So what I play here is I just play queen e2 right away. And the main thing is, can they disrupt your development. Like, that's the only thing I'm worried about. Can they disrupt my plan of castling queenside and playing h4? And I think the answer to that is just kind of an emphatic no. No, they can't. If they play the move queen a5 check, which tries to disrupt it, you can play c3, and then after c takes d4, certainly they've disrupted the plan of castles queenside. But in this case, they haven't taken time to get their king out of the middle either. So you can play the line knight to d6, king f8, and then knight back to c4, hitting the queen. After queen c5, the move I recommend is not the move that I think has been played the most. I think knight takes d4 has been played more, but I think c takes d4 is simply stronger. And then after queen to b4 check, you could play king f1, and then after knight b6, you would just bring this knight into e5. And I think white just has an advantage here. For example, after bishop takes e5, d takes e5, bishop d7. The material's even. Both kings are kind of, yeah, your king's on f1, but his king's on f8, so both kings are kind of nasty looking. But white has the more streamlined plan. White has the better bishop, white has the better pieces. White's going to continue with moves like h4, h5, king g1, king h2, and then either a3 and rook c1, or just you could just bring the rook to d1. So if you can just take a look at all those arrows, that's basically what I'm saying here. Now, if they don't play queen b4 check, I just want to point out that this pawn here is not really capturable. Like, if they play bishop takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, it allows white to castle. And just the ability to castle in this position is worth way more than a pawn. This king on f8 is not good. This rook is never going to get into the game. And the bishop and the rook over here, this is already very awkward development. So we're taking a look at something like, for an instance, knight f6. We could just play rook fd1. And you can see my rooks are coming to these open files with tempo. And this king is very uncomfortable right here. I mean, we're going to be threatening rook d8. It's not clear how you can develop your bishop without losing it to some sort of tactical trick. And all the pieces are coming to life, and white's king is just tucked away nice and safe. I'll give up a pawn every day for a position like this. So this is just not really playable. Okay, so that's if they try queen a5 check. Of course, the alternatives are they could try to either take on d4 right away, or they could castle. And I'll just kind of cover that with the same line, because it comes out the same. Because like I said, I just ignore everything. I don't care. I don't care about this pawn on d4. They can have it. So I'm just going to castle queenside, and they're going to go ahead and take c takes d4. So c takes d4 first, castles queenside, castles kingside is covered under the same line. So basically I'm going to play h4 here, and my plan is going to be the same against almost any black moves. Is I'm just going to play king b1 and knight on f to g5, and then I'm just going to kind of let my attack play itself. I can continue assaulting with g4, g5 if I have to, and there's lots of tricks with knight h7, knight f6. So I'm just going to show you some details with how this attack would continue. So for example, queen a5, king b1, and here I think like objectively best is something like bishop e7. And I think the point of a move like bishop e7, which like basically abandons this pawn on d4, is that you can actually meet the real threat of knight fg5 with the move h6. And the point is there's nothing on f6 for me to capture. So the idea of playing knight h7, which is kind of my main idea here, doesn't work, because there's nothing for me to capture on f6 if king takes knight. So I don't have any tricks here. So if bishop e7, like objectively best is just to play knight takes d4, get my pawn back, and then I just have more space, I have a better attacking position, and, white just has a slight edge. So that's why I'm not worried about the pawn on d4. Yeah, they can have it, because I'm just, if they play best, I'm going to get it back later. If they leave the bishop on e7, if they leave the bishop on f6 and just hang on to that pawn, they're giving me a target on the king side that I can latch onto with the idea of knight f to g5. So that's basically what I'm going after. So like king b1, a6, I'll just give you some for examples. Knight f g5, let's say they play h6 right away. Well, now this idea of knight h7 works, because I have a piece here that I can take. And of course, this could have actually gone even worse. So like, for example, knight f g5, if they play b5 and cut off their queen, I can sack. I can just play knight captures h7, and that's just winning. So like, for example, king h7, knight f6, king h8, queen h5 is mate. So like, this is a big problem that they have to avoid. So even in this position, knight h7 is pretty uncomfortable, Because like knight h7, king h7, knight f6 check, king h8, I can just trade on d7 with my knight, and then I can bring my queen into e4, and I can threaten this mate on h7, and I can threaten the pawn on d4. And the reason we want to do it in this order and just not harvest this pawn on d4 using some other method is because we're going to require them to make some sort of pawn move over here on the king side, and that's going to weaken their king further before we capture this pawn on d4, leaving white with a considerable advantage, both in space, development. He has the better piece, the better bishop, and he's going to have fewer weaknesses with his king. And black is going to have a lot of weaknesses. So, for example, maybe the best way to go is f5 and then queen takes d4. I think f5 is at least a little bit better than g6, because g6 kind of runs into h5, which is one of the advantages of having this h4 pawn here. It wasn't just to support knight to g5, it was to support the eventual queen to e4 with the idea that he'll have to play something like g6 as his preference, and then I'll have h5 just ready to go. And I'm just going to play h5 and just break up the position of those pawns in front of the king right away. So this is basically the type of system that I'm going to play against any d captures e4 setup. Just this is the type of system that I'm aiming for. I'm aiming for something like either knight f6 or bishop f6, and then queen e2, h4, castles queenside, and then knight on f to g5 to loosen up the position, or queen e4 if I don't have a knight on e4 already. Queen e4 followed by h5. So this is the idea, and I'm going to follow this plan against just about any setup with early d captures e4. And it's workable. It's workable in all situations. If it's workable in this situation where they're winning a pawn and trying to hold it, it's workable in all other situations. So the only other line you have to know, and you do have to know it if they try to avoid the main line, is after knight f6, bishop g5, bishop e7, they can actually try to avoid the main line one other way here, which is after the move e5, instead of just going into the main line with knight fd7, they can avoid the main line with the move knight to e4. And this is actually kind of tricky. This has its own tricks. So if they play knight to e4, the first thing is you have to play bishop takes e7 because your bishop was double attacked. You don't have much of a choice. And then queen takes e7. And then here's a critical moment. I do not recommend taking this knight. And it's actually kind of interesting. For starters, I don't recommend taking it because it's clearly what black is prepared for. He's prepared for you to take this knight. I'm sure he has preparation on it. But that's not the only reason. The second reason is these pawns, and your first glance you might think, well, if I play takes, look at this pawn. It should be easy for me to harvest or to capture. It's actually not. It's actually kind of easier for black to support that pawn and have that pawn controlling squares in your position than it is for you to just kind of pick it up and harvest it. If you look at your pieces, the only pieces that have really good access to that pawn would be your queen. And it's not so easy for your queen to just capture that pawn. And I just don't recommend this. Because I'll give you, for instance, I could play c3, which prevents queen to b4 check. And now I'm preparing to play queen c2 and capture the pawn. And then black can just kind of ignore you and just castle kingside. And then queen c2. Well, this looks like a solid idea. I'm preparing to just play queen captures c4. But this pawn is actually really easy to support. And this is good for not just this variation, but for other variations. You have to understand what happens when a knight goes to a square like e4 and you recapture with a pawn. And you end up with these kind of pawns that just look like they're on their own and they can't be defended and you should be able to capture them. They're not usually very easy to get rid of. And the reason is because black has always got a move like this. He can play f5. And you think, well, that's no big deal. I can take f5 en passant. He takes back, and then look, this pawn is still weak. But this pawn isn't capturable. Because if I play queen captures c4, you have queen f2 here. Black has more than enough activity to defend this pawn. We can make a special word for this. We'll call it actively defending. He's defending that pawn because you don't have time to take it because you're getting attacked. And if you just insist on trying to take this pawn, you're going to make your pieces very awkward doing that. So, like, for example, if you play the move knight h3, look how offsides everything is. Black can, again, just kind of ignore everything, and he can hit the center. He can play e5. And not only is he liquidating his doubled pawns, he's making it impossible for you to capture this pawn on e4. Because now if you capture this pawn on e4, there's problems on h3. He can just play bishop captures h3. Another issue is now he's threatening to open up this e-file and attack your king and queen this way. There's huge problems here. So, just queen e4, bishop h3, gh3, queen f2 is an issue. And then there's other issues. So you would actually be best placed to just take on e5 and then castle queenside. But then I wouldn't exactly say that white has this stellar position, that we can write home about, that we can say, wow, white's doing really great. I think white's position is really awkward. We have this knight on h3 that isn't very well placed. And, black has this pawn in the middle that he's managed to keep, and he's got a lot of space. He's doing really good here. So I don't recommend this. I don't recommend if they play knight to e4, bishop e7, queen e7, I do not recommend taking the knight on e4. What I recommend is just get a simple advantage. One of the things that black has done here is he's traded off his dark squared bishop for your dark squared bishop, and your dark squared bishop wasn't very good to begin with, and his dark squared bishop was. I just recommend bishop d3. Just force this exchange on c3. And this is the other critical thing to remember. It does force the exchange on c3 because he does not have the move queen b4. So that's the main thing. That's the only thing you really have to be concerned about is, does he have queen b4? And the answer is he does not, because you can just simply go, hey, what are you doing? Why are you playing queen b4? This is kind of silly. And nothing seems to work here after a3. So for instance, if he just takes the pawn on b2, you have knight a4 trapping the queen. And of course he doesn't have queen d4 because, take a second, pause the video, see if you can find the move, because bishop b5 check. And that's going to win the queen on d4. So bishop b5, c6, queen takes d4. Okay, so queen takes d4 is out. You might be asking, well, can they do anything else after knight a4 to try to get their queen out? Well, they can try knight takes f2. And of course, if you respond with the horrible queen takes f2 question mark, they can play queen to d4, and they're playing this with check, and then they're picking up the knight on a4. That would be great for them. But of course, after knight f2, you just take the queen. And then they take your queen, and then you can just take, and you have a whole piece. This is something else I just want to note. Do not be afraid of trading queens in the French. If you can saddle black with this bad bishop, that's going to be a problem for the rest of the game. And I'll show you an example of that here in a second. But for example, queen b4, a3, another option that they have is they can play knight takes c3. But again, like I said, I'm not afraid of trading queens in the French. A takes b4, knight b1, king d1. And I just have an advantage here, and an easy advantage, because black is going to be saddled with this bad bishop for the rest of the game. So if we go back and we look at knight e4, and we look at bishop e7, queen e7, bishop d3, I think the only move that's really playable is knight takes, not knight takes c3 there, but bishop d3. I think the only move that's really playable is knight takes c3 here. And then we're going to have b takes c3 and c5. And I'm just going to show you a game real quick. I'm not going to comment a whole lot on it, because I don't want this video to be like 3 hours, but I'm not going to comment forever on it. But this was actually a game Alexander Alekhine was playing the black pieces, and the person playing the white pieces was a player by the name of Byrne. And I just think any game where Alekhine loses the game is instructive, because Alexander Alekhine, with all of his tactical genius and his endgame ability, both of which were top-notch and definitely the best in the world, really at any time that Alexander Alekhine was playing chess, he did not manage to win this game. Actually, he lost. And white did nothing special here. He just traded pieces and ended up saddling black with this bad bishop. So just to show you this game, these are just kind of typical French defense moves. White didn't really demonstrate any particular brilliance here. He just kind of traded, and he just kept trading pieces off. No real plan. Let's just trade. Let's trade rooks. Let's bring the knight over there, and then hey, let's trade queens. And actually, anytime you can trade queens against Alexander Alekhine, that's good, because that guy was, tactically, he was a genius. So you wanted to trade queens. He was also probably one of the best endgame players that ever lived, so you almost didn't want to get into an endgame with him. But even Alexander Alekhine couldn't fix this endgame. He couldn't fix the fact that his bishop on d7 was just so atrociously bad. So knight takes a1, and then we have a lot of maneuvering here, and I'm just going to say, I don't think white had like the world's greatest technique in this game. But at the same time, he did manage to get all of Alekhine's pawns to light squares. And he made sure that no matter what, black ended up with just this bishop on c6 versus this knight. And that bishop is useless. So his technique at this point didn't have to be perfect. I think just no matter what, eventually white's going to win. No matter how brilliant the person playing the black pieces is, they really can't fix this when not a single pawn is on a square where they can even attack it, and not a single one of their pawns is on a square that's not in the way. So this bishop is just worse than a big pawn. It's not even a big pawn. It's just useless. So Alexander Alekhine and all of his brilliance couldn't fix this, and White, with all of his kind of almost, in some cases, I would say mindless maneuvering, didn't manage to screw it up. Once he got this knight back to c5 with check, it was pretty much over. But any number of ways to maneuver could have won the game just as easily. And eventually, the great Alexander Alekhine had to call it a day. He could not fix this. His bishop just didn't have anything to do. So that's basically how you deal with the non-main lines of the French. And in the next video, we're going to go over the main lines. We're going to go over the Alekhine chartered attack. And in the final video, we're going to be going over the main line Winnower variation. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you.